Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And today, I've got some guests on. It's going to try to talk to you about being your better self. And in politics, people always kind of criticize the folks that jump out here and run for office. And so I really think it's important for people who are considering running or being involved in politics that they are their best self. And especially from an emotional, mental standpoint. So these guests have written books, and I wanted them to come on and share those concepts, especially in a political context. Because to be honest, politicians are human beings. I know some of y'all don't think that, but we are. We're human beings. So I hope you enjoy those guests. And I hope you enjoyed the Republican National Convention. Very entertaining. Former President Trump set a record for the longest acceptance speech in the history of American politics. I think he talked literally for an hour and a half. And y'all say I talk a lot. He talked, at least I have a break. He talked straight for an hour and 30 minutes, at least, in accepting the nomination to run, for the third time, by the way, to run for president of the United States. And I got to hear Senator Vance accept his nomination as the vice presidential candidate on the Republican side. So while the Republicans were doing that, the Democrats are trying to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory in dealing with their nominee, or so we thought, in President Biden. And the old phrase that history is prologue is really, really coming to the fore as we're approaching a Democratic convention in Chicago. It looks like the sitting Democratic president may not be on the ballot when the convention happens, which, by the way, I still need y'all help to get there. But I'll make that pitch near the end. Anyway, let's go ahead and kick this show off. And you know how we do it. We started off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. President Biden tested positive for COVID-19 with mild symptoms while campaigning in Las Vegas. Donald Trump officially accepted his party's nomination at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, days after surviving an assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. Trump selected Ohio U.S. Senator J.D. Vance as his vice presidential running mate. Vice President Kamala Harris invited Senator Vance to join an August 13th debate hosted by CBS following his selection. President Biden condemned political violence after the assassination attempt on Trump, stating that such violence is unacceptable. U.S. District Judge Aileen Cannon dismissed a criminal case against Donald Trump regarding his retention of classified documents. A New York federal jury found New Jersey U.S. Senator Bob Menendez guilty on 16 felony counts, including bribery at his corruption trial. At least 3 U.S. House Democrats are protesting a fast-track plan to hold a July 21st virtual roll call vote on President Biden's nomination. Major Democratic donors have withheld $90 million in pledged donations to a pro-Biden super PAC due to concerns about President Biden's candidacy. A federal appeals court rejected a constitutional challenge to Tennessee's policy preventing transgender individuals from amending their birth certificates. Arkansas's top election officials rejected petitions for an abortion rights measure to appear on the November ballot due to missing paperwork. A federal appeals court allowed the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to proceed with its redlining case against a non-bank mortgage lender. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell confirmed his plans to complete his term, which ends in 2026. And the price of first-class U.S. mail stamps has increased to 73 cents as part of a broader 7.8% increase in mailing services products. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my first guest, Farah Harris. Farah Harris is a psychotherapist and a workplace belonging and well-being expert dedicated to disrupting unhealthy work environments. She is the founder and CEO of Working Well Daily, a company that approaches workplace belonging and well-being from a psychosocial and emotional intelligence lens. Farah has helped individuals and Fortune 500 companies develop healthier workplaces where employees want to stay and thrive because their leaders and teams have grown in empathy, self-awareness, social awareness, and cultural awareness. As a mental health practitioner and consultant, Farah is aware of the intersectionality between well-being, equity, and inclusion. She is a sought-after expert on mental health, psychological safety, workplace culture, and emotional intelligence. Her work has been featured in media and podcast platforms such as Forbes, Fast Company, Business Insider, Harvard Business Review, Huffington Post, Essence, Good Morning America, Martha Stewart, Thrive Global, and Therapy for Black Girls. Farah is also the author of the international best-selling book, The Color of Emotional Intelligence, Elevating Our Self and Social Awareness to Address Inequities, a groundbreaking exploration of how cultural background and influence our emotional intelligence and shape our relationships with others. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Farah Harris. All right, Farah Harris. How you doing, sister? You doing good?
I am doing well. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I know that you're up in the Chicago area, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I know that Mother Nature kind of showed out a little bit up there. So I'm glad that
Did.
I'm glad we're able to connect. So We're going to see how this works. I'm going to be up there for the convention, so push come to shove, maybe we can connect up there as well. But let's go ahead
Yes.
and get this started. So what I like to do with my guests is throw a quote at them first, kind of like an icebreaker, and then go from there. So your quote is, between stimulus and response, there's space. In that space lies our freedom and power to choose our response. In our response lies growth and freedom. What does that quote mean to you?
Ooh, the power of the pause. The power of the pause. Yes, that is the opportunity to either choose wisdom, to respond well, or to choose folly and react and deal with the consequences thereof.
Yeah. Um, in a recent LinkedIn post, you started by writing, um, well, you started it by writing, many fall into the trap of having toxic positivity, suppressing their feelings, disassociating, or judging their emotions. Explain in detail the concept of toxic positivity.
Yeah, I've had to explain this several times to those who, especially leaders, who want to inspire and motivate their team, so they're always talking about, look at the silver lining and, we can do this. And there's nothing wrong with having that go get 'em attitude. But if we're not careful, it can rob us of the natural human experience of grief or disappointment. And so when we feel like someone's kind of almost rushing through our pain or our frustration or dismissing them, it can actually cause us to not feel safe with them, not feel safe expressing our emotions, not feel safe feeling whatever it is that we're feeling. So toxic positivity does not leave space for real feelings. It's not necessarily solution focused, which is what we want, especially having emotional intelligence. You want to be able to go, well, what will be the end result? But in that, thinking about what the end result is, you still, or desire that you would want it to be, you're still acknowledging the frustration, the disappointment, maybe even the anger. But toxic positivity often ignores those emotions, pushes past those emotions, or dismiss them. It reminds me actually of a client that I had years ago. Her oldest son was murdered, and she tried to kind of over spiritualize, in a way, use the toxic positivity, like, well, the Lord gives and he takes away, and it's going to be okay. And I just didn't want to lose my witness. And I said, okay, but did you make time to grieve? And she said, I grieved. I said, no, no, no. Like, to really sit in the sorrow of what happened to your son. And I think I was the only person that gave her room to actually feel maybe even the anger that she had towards God, the disappointment. And she wept every session for like 6 sessions. Even my what you call it, my receptionist was like, "What are you doing in there?" She comes in, and the first thing I hear is her just weeping and wailing. I'm like, this is 20 years of like closed up, locked up grief, because she thought she had to, I guess, present the Lord well to everybody else by making it seem like all was okay. And it's like, no, 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 not on this side of glory. We're going to deal with pain. We're going to deal with loss. And so that's the negative side of that toxic positivity. It doesn't allow you to feel the whole human experience of all the emotions that we have.
Yeah. So you wrote this book called The Color of Emotional Intelligence,
I
elevating
did.
elevating ourself and social awareness to address inequities. Why did you feel the need to write this book at this time?
That's a great question, Eric, because I did not want to write the book. It was like, as I was writing, I was like, the world don't need this. This is too hard. This is frustrating. As a mom of three young children and married and running a business, I was like, who has time to write a book? But to be honest with you, it was, I say it wasn't a labor of love, but an act of obedience, because at that time, this was post 2020. I want to say just a few months after George Floyd's murder, an organization had come to me to come speak to their Black employees and kind of have like a healing circle. And I'm using quotation marks. Um, and I had asked who had come to speak to their people before. They had had other speakers, other therapists. And I said, what would be different? What other resource, what benefit, what impact can I make? Because I don't want to just give them another, mental health, well-being, self-care presentation. And this organization at that time, obviously nothing we were doing was in person. And so they were losing a lot of revenue. And I knew that there were about to be some layoffs or some furloughing that was going to be going on. And I said, has anybody talked to your organization about emotional intelligence, and specifically to your Black employees, about how they use their EQ, aka their emotional intelligence, differently? That they have an elevated level of social awareness, because since we were children, we've learned how to read the room. We've learned what is okay, what's not okay. How am I supposed to talk? How am I supposed to act? Am I going to be accepted? Can I actually almost disappear to not be threatening? Those types of things, and how that's impacting them at work. And she was like, oh, no one's ever talked to her, to them about that. And as I was telling her, I don't want to say I was making it up on the fly, but it's like, as I was saying, I said, that actually sounds like something I want to dig into. And I was saying, we should do this not just for your Black employees, but have, all of other races and genders and just everybody on deck, because what is the point of providing them this understanding of how they're showing up, understanding more about what code switching and masking is, and the people and the environment or the culture that creates them showing up in this manner are unaware. And she's like, no, I just want this to be just for the Black employees. And sure enough, on that Zoom call, people in the comments like, man, I really wish my white counterparts were here. And that made me think, okay, there's something here. And it became one of my most sought after talks in 2021. And it became, pun intended, more colorful. So it wasn't just the Black experience. It was, when you're a woman and you walk into a room that's predominantly male, how do you show up? How do you react? If you're a neurodivergent, if you have some type of disability, if you are part of the LGBTQ community, every one of those communities recognize what it's like to either code switch or mask. And it is creating work environments where people aren't really able to show up because they're not able to be their full selves. And I think it's hilarious that they keep talking about bring your authentic self into the workplace. And I'm like, where do they do that at? Because even amongst yourselves in your white brotherhood and sisterhood, there isn't always that safety to be yourself. So even more so, imagine what that is like to be a person who's part of a historically marginalized community. So that's why I was like, okay, I guess the book should come out.
Well, and first of all, I want to commend you for the discipline to having a good idea and then actually writing it down, right? Because I do that, it's like, oh, this is pretty cool. And then I don't write it down. And now it's like, what was I thinking the other day? So I'm glad you did that. And then the other thing, when you said the phrase read the room, right? Because, I had the distinction of being a state legislator, and I'm supposed to represent a constituency. And my constituency, when I first got in, was like 85% Black, right? So if I came in as my authentic self, and it was the it would have been just total, I don't know what they would have done to me. All I know is that me being creative to present a Black agenda in that body, I think that's something that a lot of Black people have to do when you're saying, okay, well, be authentic. we tend to be more creative. There's a lot of people, they don't necessarily code switch, but it's like, how can I tone this down, or how can I make it so it's
Mm-hmm.
relatable? Real quick, I remember we were trying to pass a law to mandate seatbelts, that everybody wears seatbelts. And one of my colleagues came to me and said, Eric, the way you presented that, you made white folks feel like they were saving black people by voting for this bill. So I definitely understand about reading the room and trying to navigate those kind of things. Um, you broke up the book in three parts: emotional intelligence in
Mm-hmm.
black and white, emotional intelligence in color, and for allies, but you separated, it said for all and parenthetically to IES.
Mm-hmm.
What is the significance of these three parts? I guess the essence of my question is, why did you feel you had to break it down in such a way, especially for the last part for the allies?
That's a good question. So it actually goes back to the beginning. So when I created the presentation, it was broken down in those three parts. I didn't label it that way, but it was kind of, how can I explain to you how historically marginalized use emotional intelligence differently if you don't even understand what emotional intelligence is. So I would start off the presentation just giving a breakdown, high level overview of what EQ was. And then once I was like, okay, now that you understand the domains, now that you understand, neurologically, the neuroscience of, how our brain works as we're processing emotions, now that you get that, let's shift over to how certain groups are using that knowledge in a unique way. And then it bled into, okay, but why do people even have to show up in this manner? Why do people have to code switch or feel that they have to code switch for survival? It's because they're in spaces that, we now have this new term, psychological safety, that's becoming more popular. But in a sense, they don't feel like they belong. They don't think that they're safe. So what could we all do as, I call it, being good stewards of humanity versus allies? How can we all show up better so that I don't have to have Eric feel like he has to, mince his words or enable a community or conversation to a certain group? He can just be himself. And so that was kind of, in essence, the 90-minute talk. So we would spend the intro understanding what an EQ was, then being able to, quote unquote, add more color to it. And it was like, okay, now thinking what it's like to be a woman, think about what it's like to be a person, of a different religion. I'm just thinking about Ramadan that passes in the workplace, the common religions and not religion, that's not the word I'm looking for. The common holidays that we celebrate are typically Easter, Christmas, and we're not even thinking about all the different religions that are within our organization being represented by people and how it could impact how they work. So, you sitting here trying to schedule lunch meetings during the time that someone's fasting, it's like, okay, this puts me in a precarious position. So I really wanted people not just to see themselves, which is beautiful when I get the feedback, was like, oh, you gave language to what I was experiencing, as a Black woman or as a person with neurodivergence. But it's really cool to hear from people who have greater privilege that go, you are really helping me read the room. You are really helping me to understand how I was moving through spaces completely unaware, and I say this, that privilege has blind spots, of what other people could be experiencing. And that's why I had the last section, because even my book coach was like, I mean, this book is getting kind of long. Like, do you think that this should be like a separate book? And I thought about it and I said, no, folks can read this. And it was definitely during the time where a lot of DEI books were coming out. And I said, people will want to read this if they intentionally pick up the book. And I want to make sure that I write it in a way that it doesn't seem like it's this long book. And I don't think it's that long. I mean, Cast is a long book. and it's dense, and I mean, it's amazing, but I'm glad that I moved forward with my instincts versus, my writing coach who was like, you want there to be an easy read. People don't like to read nowadays. And I said, no, people don't like to read what they don't want to read. But if you want to read a book, you're going to read your book.
Yeah, and I think people are more inclined to read books now. They might do it a different way now, like electronically or listen to it,
Right.
but books are still important, and that's what we've been trying to tell people on the other side of the political aisle. But that's a whole nother discussion for another day. You state that practicing the three A's will help you build your emotional intelligence. Explain the three A's for the audience.
Sure. The three A's is the framework of emotional intelligence that I thought would, one, be memorable, so it's aware, assess, and address. So you're aware of your emotions, how they show up, not just being able to name them, but how they show up in your body. So if you're listening in the audience, think to yourself, when you're angry, what does your body do? Does it tense up? Do you begin to sweat, heart palpitations? Do you make a fist? These types of things. So once you're able to build that self-awareness, so it's not just being able to, oh, I feel sad or I feel upset. More often your body will let you know how you feel before you can even name it. So it's being able to practice that pause and be able to go, okay, my body's saying this, that must mean I'm feeling this. Once you're able to name the feeling, then you assess it. Why do I feel this way? What's coming up? So I joke in the book and when I do my talks is that I am a walking Snickers commercial. A sister gets hangry, feed me, please. So if I am not fed, you get a different version of me. And so having that moment of assessment, it's like if I'm being irritable, if I'm being short, impatient with, whoever I'm speaking with, if it's my kids, my husband, whomever, I have to go, well, why am I being like this? Oh, it's because I missed breakfast or, it's time for lunch or whatever is going on. So now I can go, I feel this way because, and now I have the opportunity to address the situation. How do I want to address the communication that I'm having with this person? How do I want to address my attitude in this current situation? I want to make sure that the action going forward is going to be productive. So some of us can be aware of how we feel, and we may even know how we feel and why we feel that way, but we choose to address the situation in a negative way. I'm going to cuss this person out, or I'm going to ignore you, or I'm going to withhold love. What we want to do is hopefully address the situation in a productive manner. So the three A's: aware, assess, address. What am I feeling? Why do I feel this way? And how do I want to address the situation?
Yeah, and you remind me about those lunch meetings. My strategy of lunch meetings was always to try to eat first before I said anything. I could be listening to you or whatever, but I'm gonna put some in my system first. And it was a meeting that I was
Yes.
chairing. I just pray that I could make it through to the end because I'm gonna have to save my food if I'm the one that's doing the talking or whatever. But yeah, I definitely relate to all that and it's good that we figure that out because a lot of times we just don't understand why did I react that way? And the biggest thing we always put on ourselves is maturity, right? Well, if I was more mature, I could handle that better, or I should have handled it better. But it's like you are who you are. You are how you're made up. And if you don't have a sense of what triggers you or what gets you upset, then it doesn't matter what level of maturity, how old you are, whatever, it's still going to impact you.
That part. I mean, there are definitely people who skip that middle part. They recognize how I'm upset, and then they just address the situation or they act. And it's like, well, you didn't take time to assess, and really go, you know what? I get triggered every time. So what you just explained was like, I have a plan now that if I'm going to be somewhere, I'm going to put something in my belly because I know that if I don't, that I may not be able to focus, or my tone might be different. So that is the practicing. I say emotional intelligence is nothing that we ever achieve. It's an opportunity for us to practice, like patience. Go to the DMV. You will definitely have an opportunity to practice your patience there. So it's like People are like, I want to have high EQ. Okay. This morning, how did you treat your kids? How did you talk to, your direct report? These are all opportunities for us to practice the 3 A's, but we have to also go, why do I always do this when? And then we can find out it's anytime that we feel disrespected is when we start popping off, or when we feel like someone is not listening to us is how we shut down. And so when you can get to the root of it, then you can start making your plans and your strategy so that it doesn't cause you to create these negative reactions to it.
So, do you think that our inability to assess is our biggest barrier to emotional intelligence?
Ooh, Eric, that's a good question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. Oh, wow. Oh, well, as a therapist, I would say yes, just because most of what we do in therapy is not just talk about the feelings, but at least in the way that I practice therapy is I do mix theories like cognitive behavioral theory, but with narrative therapy, because it doesn't make sense to break down your thinking and your behaviors if we don't go to the origin of why you think this way and why you behave this way. So the assessment part is the self-auditing part. It's the understanding your who and your why. We come from, one of my favorite chapters in the book is chapter 6, the emotional narratives. What are your stories around feelings? How did you even learn about emotions? How did your family talk about them? Folks always say, "Oh, our family never talked about them." Like, no, they talked about feelings. They just didn't always use words. You watched, them drinking their sorrow. You watched them be sarcastic or physically violent because they didn't know how to process their sadness or their anger. You watched when your mom withheld affection from you, and then you go, oh, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. Or maybe you learn this is what I'm not supposed to do. But when you can assess why you are a people pleaser, why you react a certain way, more than likely it comes from your family of origin, and how you first learned about, feelings. This is why we have a lot of toxic masculinity. We told little boys to man up, get over it. You can't cry. You can't show any tenderness. And then we have grown men who want to be tender, who want to show empathy, who want to have a space to just feel feelings. And and I feel like y'all can't catch a break. I mean, we women go through our things too, but as men, it's either it's viewed as weakness, if you do express yourself, or they may say that it's an effeminate type of thing, or you get penalized for not showing empathy and tenderness. And it was like, oh, you so hard, you're so whatever. I can't get to you, especially if this is a partner. He's so cold, you're so standoffish. And so it's like, well, where can I just feel? But we've learned within our families and within society, we tell little boys, you can't be tender. And so why are we surprised that we have men who struggle with tenderness?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is getting personal. So let me get back to this is a political show. So I'm gonna ask you this question. Do you think the way we handle American politics is a great example of what you caution against in the chapter Walk the Dog?
The dogs are loose, Eric. The dogs are running amok. For your listeners who don't understand the walk the dog analogy, I break down emotional intelligence as, for those who are dog owners, you will definitely get this. But we've all seen people who are quote unquote walking their dog, but it seems more like their dog is walking them. Their dog is like 10 feet ahead. They're pulling and yanking at the leash. And when I watched The Dog Whisperer, Cesar Millan was training his clients, and he said to properly walk your dog, it can't walk in front because it will believe it's the pack leader, that it's in control. It can't walk behind you because it will, it's passivity. You can't see what the dog's doing. You want the dog walking in lockstep with you. And I don't know what it did to my neurospicy brain, but it was like, oh, connection, connection, connection. This is what's going on. This is emotional intelligence. This is what it is at its best. You don't want your feelings to walk ahead of you because you don't want your emotions to be in control. You also don't want your emotions to be behind you because that can have you show up as passive or passive aggressive in your presentation, in your behavior, and your actions. What you want to do is be able to recognize your emotions in real time so that you can see them, you can name them. And this is the 3 A's that I was talking about. And you can be able to manage your emotions in real time. In the climate that we're in now, no one's walking their dog well. All our dogs are running. We are very emotionally driven, and it's out of control.
Yeah. Our politics, the whole concept of politics is that we're supposed to intellectually debate issues, and we are so far from that. A classic example, as we're recording this, the Republicans are having a national convention, and there's a whole state delegation that now has bandages on their ears, right, to line up with their candidate. That's emotional. That ain't got nothing to do with what he's talking about as far as policy or anything like that. It's just strictly um, him, them trying to connect with him. And, you know, I don't know. It's just, yeah, yeah. I agree with you that we're the dogs have gotten loose and that they're not, uh, they're not on a leash at all.
Eric, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I just want to say that emotional intelligence, again, is not a zenith. We don't always reach the final, pinnacle. It's an opportunity for us to practice every single day to have high emotional intelligence. And something I just want to leave with your listeners is that a reminder, rather, is that you can have a low emotional reaction, just rebound with a high emotional response, a high EQ response, rather. And so, oftentimes people think that emotional intelligence means that you are always cool, calm, and collected, and that's not true. And so, having high EQ doesn't mean that you always get it right. It just means that you right what you got wrong. So, you can have a low EQ reaction. Just make sure you rebound with a high EQ response. Thank you again for
And
having me.
oh well, thank you for coming on, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time out, and especially with all the technical challenges we've had. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Farah Harris, and the name of her book is "The Color of Emotional Intelligence: Elevating Ourself and Social Awareness to Address Inequities." All right, guys, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. Hello, this is Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, and I need your help. We have an opportunity to cover the Democratic National Convention in Chicago this August, but I need to raise some money. So I need you to go to gofundme.com/help a moment with Eric Fleming broadcast from DNC 2024. That's gofundme.com, help a moment with Eric Fleming broadcast from DNC 2024. Thank you so much. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next set of guests, right? So instead of having one other guest, I have two. Dr. Adaira Landry, and Dr. Resa Lewis. Adaira Landry, MD, MED, is an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital, and co-founder of Writing in Color. Resa E. Lewis, MD, is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and creator and host of the Visible Voices podcast. Both of them have co-authored a book called MicroSkills, Small Actions, Big Impact. And that's what we're going to be talking about today on the podcast. So, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as guests on this podcast Dr. Adaira Landry and Dr. Resa Lewis. All right. Dr. Adaira Landry and Dr. Resa Lewis. How y'all ladies doing? Y'all doing all right?
We're doing great.
So great to be here.
Well, I'm honored to have y'all. It's very rare that I get a doctor on, let alone two doctors on this political podcast. But y'all have written a book that I think people that are engaged in politics and really in life in general, but engaged in politics, they need to read this book too. And the book is called MicroSkills. And how I like to start off the interview is I throw a quote at the guests, and it's kind of an icebreaker. And so in the case, since I have two guests, either one can answer it or both of y'all can answer it, however y'all want to do it. So the quote is, the best strategies for success in the workplace are not so much taught as they are expected to be known. Worse still, there is a pervasive myth that some people have it and some don't. What does that quote mean?
We wrote this book because when we were early career professionals, we felt that our peers, some of our peers, seemed to have this playbook that had a bunch of strategies within it, secrets to success within it, and they were able to move their careers much faster than we were able to. And so we wanted to write a book that really spoke to, actually, we all can gain access to these strategies and these skills if we're just told how to do it. And in the book, we really talk about, it's not just like, can you give a lecture? Can you use Microsoft Excel? It's also, how do you communicate with others? How do you navigate conflict? How do you become a subject matter expert? All of these skills, many of us probably think people just have it and they're just naturally gifted, when in truth, they have been taught, they have perfected a lot of what we call micro skills to get there.
Moreover, and Eric, I want to use the word moreover right there. We love this quote that you shared because it really is where we start. We start from a place of trying to make no assumptions about the reader. We get that, number one, time's a currency. It can only be spent. You cannot put it into a savings account. So we want people to be intentional about how they use their time, with whom they spend their time. Next, the world is not equal. We all enter school, the workplace, from different places. And a lot of books in this category of business self-help don't acknowledge that, recognize that, and teach to that. And we really try to teach to that. And finally, learning is limitless if only it is accessible. So we try to create a book with content that's accessible no matter where you're starting, with the hope that these micro skills level set. So we may not have the same place at the starting line, but we all end at the same finish line.
So, Dr. Lewis, you basically took my last question and answered it already, in a sense, because that's how you conclude the book and talk about those three truths. Why is it important overall to have that basic understanding on those three truths?
Feel free to call me Resa. And I appreciate, I just want to, make sure that I'm very comfortable with you, with first names. And so, it is true. We end the book with it. And it's also in our introduction about how we wanted the reader to understand this is a place we're coming from. And as Adaira shared, we both had experiences, some very different, some similar, about looking around and wondering how everybody else had gotten a copy of this playbook. They knew how to navigate the workplace. And when we did what we call comp titles, comparative titles of books in this category, first of all, the demographic of the authors is often the same, often white, often men, often in business or C-suite types. We're not that. We are women, we are doctors, and people say, well, why are you actually able to write this book? Well, because we're also, importantly, we take care of patients in the emergency department, but we're educators. We're used to figuring out how to best make the learning accessible to our students, to our colleagues, to the reader. And books in this category often don't walk the reader through the how-to, those critical actions. And we are really aware of, to tell someone to go out and network. Networking is important. Go out and do it. And how? So we really wanted to walk the reader through the how.
I think one of the things that's unique about the book is that, yes, we are physicians, yes, we're women, but also we're educators. We have been training other people at the level of being a college student or pre-med, a medical student, a resident fellow, all these different levels on the inner workings of being a physician. And we know how to teach. And we give a lot of examples in the book on how we can teach someone, can you go do this particular procedure? And it's not like just go do it. It's let's, consent the patient. Let's drape the patient. Let's get all the equipment in order. There are all these small steps that get you there. And so I think what's really important to us is that we are really trying to make sure that we're teaching people this philosophy of how to break down large goals into small steps. And so in the book, we start every chapter with a vignette that is just sort of like brings both of us and our stories and our pathway into the book so that people can really get to know us as authors, as people. And then we get into just some context as to why we think this particular micro skill is needed, just so that people don't feel like they're doing work for the sake of work. And then I think one of the unique and human aspects of this book is that we share why it might be hard for someone to incorporate this particular micro skill. And I think that probably really does go back to being an educator and a physician. In both of those roles, we really understand why someone struggles to achieve whatever goal they are trying to get towards. And then lastly, as Resa mentions, we have these like critical actions, which are really like, what are the small steps you have to take to get to that goal of yours?
So what are micro skills? How do you define that?
Dovetailing off what Adaira just shared, these are small fundamental building blocks, small steps, and they are additive. All these steps add up to achieve the goal, the task, complete the project, incorporate the habit. And they aren't just isolated steps for one micro skill. They all actually thread throughout. So I'll give an example. Chapter 1, micro skills for self-care. One specific one we really value, we love the term, and we use is this concept of the personal board of directors. And listeners can imagine a table, an imaginary table, not a real table, all the different people who are your go-to people who sit at that table. And there's always an open chair. Some people sit there for an isolated minute, and some people are with you for life. But these are the people who are vested in you to succeed and help you achieve your goals in your professional journey. They're also the ones that are going to provide feedback, the ones with whom you can role play difficult conversations, etc. That concept of the personal board of directors is a critical action in many of the micro skills throughout the book. So our goal is to be clear, this book is comprehensive, and also it's impossible that we achieved every single thing that everybody needs to know for every single workplace. Although, again, it's comprehensive. But our goal is to help the reader learn how to think, learn how to break down these big, paralyzing things into small pieces. And they're like, I got this.
So, Adaira, I'm going to ask you this question. Because initially I had written it out like, why did you write the book? Mm. But the way I want to ask it is, who had the idea to write the book? And how did y'all decide to collaborate on it? Because both of y'all practice in different hospitals now. So what was the genesis behind saying we need to collaborate a book?
We had been writing articles together for maybe a few years before we started even writing the book. So just to give context, Resa and I are brainwashed academics, as she often says, and that we thought that we could only really publish in like academic journals. And we had this idea together to start writing for the lay press, larger, more public audiences like Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, CNBC. And as we started to write these articles together, I think we just became more comfortable with editing each other's work. I mean, that's a very intimate, vulnerable process. And as far as the book, I've always really wanted to write a book, especially as we were writing these articles. It became more of an interest. Like, how do I make this skill of writing bigger, stronger, and have more impact? And so a book just seemed like the natural progression from a series of articles. We partnered together, actually, even before that, like, because I was looking for a mentor, someone to help me figure out like my next career steps when I was back in residency. And so, when I was a resident, Resa was not a part of my life, a part of my board of directors or anything, but someone connected us, which is, again, the power of networking, because that one single conversation led us to here. But we started to have a few conversations, and then there was like this one sort of more important conversation where I was asking her about how do I become a subject matter expert with mentorship, and we started talking about writing and speaking, and she said this one thing that I think, many of us have heard multiple times and maybe just like, washed it away or forgot about it, which is, if you ever want to, do this together, let me know. And in that case, she said, if you ever want to write together, let me know. Now, I could have easily said, yeah, sure, and like forgot about that offering, but I actually like leaned in, and truly we started to write together. And that one little open door, led us to writing articles, giving talks. Now we have a book together. We're doing these podcasts. So like, it just really speaks to like this idea of seizing the opportunity and moving forward.
Also, the world is small. And, in our world of academic emergency medicine, Adaira and I have a lot of geographic overlap. Mostly we've been in the Northeast, and even more mostly in New England. And we know a lot of the same people. We both have studied emergency medicine. We both have studied being educators. We both have studied an ultrasound diagnostic tool. A imaging diagnostic tool called ultrasound. So there's lots of overlaps where we've interacted.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to this question. I'm going to list some micro skills that I think, well, before I ask that, do you think it's important for politicians to utilize micro skills?
I can start in about health and that chapter to which I referred, MicroSkills for Self-Care. I strongly believe in a broad definition, and actually it's not just me, but what I was going to say, I'll get to the part about politicians and civic health. That chapter 1, we broadly defined health. It's not just physical health because we're doctors. We talk about social health, community health, mental health, financial health. And I think civic health is a part of that health. And so I realize civic health is not the same as politicians, but we think this way of thinking and approaching essentially any issue is applicable. So if politicians, for the sake of argument, are dealing with a large issue, a large topic, then why not break it down? Because not only can it be more comprehensible and achievable for yourself, if you're trying to convince an audience, you're trying to move a crowd, breaking it down into small pieces so it's digestible, so people understand you, it makes sense.
I would assume a life as a politician is quite similar to the life of an emergency medicine doctor, where there's, high stress decisions, lots of potential impact with every choice you're making. And because of that, it sets you up for interpersonal conflict, interpersonal collaboration, this sort of idea of how do I learn the culture of, the office that I just joined, and how do I work with all of these people? Like, that's very similar to being a doctor or being a lawyer or being a teacher. These are just universal experiences for someone who is employed or just a student trying to figure out how to navigate that environment. And so I think it's applicable to any professional for sure. I think when it comes to politicians, of course, my mind goes to conflict. And we have a chapter specifically on navigating conflict. And I think one of the most important aspects of that chapter to me is trying to mitigate your assumptions about someone else, and entering a conversation sort of with this idea of I want to be more curious about their perspective, their viewpoints before I start just sort of making assumptions as to what they mean. And so as an observer of politicians, that seems like that would be a very helpful skill set.
Well, I'm glad you have such a high esteem for politicians.
I
Having
respect
been
the work. I respect the work. I mean, it's hard work. It's hard work.
well, having been well, that's okay. But having been one myself, I wish that we lived up to the comparison. I think being an emergency room physician, especially depending on the location, I think you encounter a lot more stress and a lot more. You have to do a lot more compartmentalization compared to us sitting in the legislature trying to get a budget done by the end of April. You know what I'm saying? But I appreciate it. I appreciate the respect. But that gets back to what I was going to say, because outside of navigating conflict, here's some micro skills that I think are important to political people. Set realistic timelines. Pause before accepting an opportunity. Overcome discomfort, with networking. And select tasks to take off your plate. Based on your knowledge of politicians and your high esteem, do you agree with my selections, and why do you agree with those?
I do. I think they are. It sounds like a lot of it has to do with the idea of connecting. I mean, being a politician, you need to have a base of people to support you. That's going to require networking. And I think a lot of folks who are uncomfortable with the idea of introducing themselves to others, pitching who they are and what they're good at and what they are looking for in others, nurturing a relationship in a way that feels authentic and sustainable. Like, those are clear challenges for someone who is, I think, in a position where they really rely on the people around them to move forward and to have support to move forward. So to me, that one has stuck out the most. I think the pausing before the opportunity is my personal favorite micro skill, I'll be honest. And so, yes, I can see someone in an office where they are being pitched, policy, bill, all sorts of legislation in front of them. They have to decide what makes sense. And so we wrote that particular micro skill because we wanted people to move away from this idea of saying yes to everything and to really trying to investigate very clearly what is in front of them and if this is the right fit. And by doing that, you can screen more up front and really pick things that align with your plate.
I'll add, I really like the list you selected. And as a politician, you're a public servant. You're in service to others. And this is another actually analogy of why there's similarity between politicians and doctors and academic medicine in particular. Work and people will take and take and take and take and take and take and take. And a politician has 24 hours in their day. A doctor has 24 hours in their day. So we really subscribe to this concept of, rather than FOMO, a fear of missing out, flip it to JOMO, a joy of missing out. And the more you can focus and select the items on your plate that bring you joy, that are actions, legislation on which you really, really want to work, the better the work product, the better you feel about yourself and about your work, and the better team player you are.
Well, the opportunity, pausing before accepting an opportunity, kind of works both ways in my experience. It's like, it's one thing, and it's not just legislation. It's like even deciding to run for something else. Because what we end up doing, if we end up being successful in getting elected to something, then if we show that we are capable, or we develop a following or whatever, then somebody's going to encourage us to run for something else. And in my real life experience, I had to make a decision early on because there were some people that wanted me to run for lieutenant governor. And I hesitated because I was like, how am I going to get the money and da 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 da. But then my son showed up. And so once I found out that I was going to be a dad, that helped me decide, no, I'm not going to do it at this particular moment. But then I ended up running for a statewide office later on. But it's important for people not to just fall for the trap about jumping out at something based on flattery or based on ego or whatever. And so I think that's a very important thing. The other thing I had to deal with was the networking piece, because I'm a natural introvert. And a lot of people in my life were surprised that I got into politics and even was somewhat successful, because, people in college were like, we thought you were stuck up. We didn't know that, you like to be around people. And I said, well, I know I have to talk to people to get elected. So I think those were the two that kind of really stood out to me, because I really did have to overcome a discomfort about reaching out to people. And so, Adaira, when you told the story about how you and Resa connected to do that, that's why network is important, because regardless of your discomfort, you have to reach out to people, because you never know when that next opportunity will show up.
Could not agree more. And, we do have a designated chapter, as you know, MicroSkills for networking. And we really like talking about this microskill because everybody has a network, whether they realize it or not. A lot of people think they're starting from network zero. And I identify strongly with you, Eric. I, too, am an introvert. Now, I'm actually not shy, and I think I'm socially adept. I know I'm socially adept, but I recharge solo. I like one-on-ones. And there are books written about this, and we walk the reader through how, if you're an introvert, you can still be quite successful networking. And we don't want people to take networking off their plate if they identify as an introvert, because you can be successful. We want you to be successful because it helps you be better at work.
All right. So you also encourage people to nurture their local reputation. And that also definitely struck a nerve as far as being a politician. Why is that so crucial, and what are some ways to do it?
I bet you have a lot of stories to share, Eric.
Uh-huh.
I think when you're on the up and up, you're a shooting star, you're a rising star, and people are pouring a lot of energy into you. Like you said earlier, it can be very easy to be distracted by the opportunity, by the flattery, and think about the more shiny object in front of you. And that can cause distractions especially if you're trying to gain, a reputation from, let's say, city to county to state to national sort of growth. You can forget the step that occurred before and the people that helped you along the way. And so it's really important as you're growing up to remember those who you relied upon so much, who helped you. And so you want to really nurture that reputation. You want to make sure that you are paying attention to your roles and your responsibilities there as well, and not just like forgetting people, ghosting people, dropping things like in the middle of a crisis because something else, like I said, is much bigger and better in front of you. There's this balance, and you want to be thoughtful of like, yes, I could be developing this large national reputation, but what do people think of me locally? And the reason why we wanted to do this chapter, I mean, I have a personal experience with this where I was a part of a startup, and one of the leaders of the startup had this like amazing national reputation. You could even argue international reputation in a field. But the people who knew this individual up close and personal within the company had a very different impression of them. And so, behind the scenes, there were different conversations happening, and that could really affect your reputation. And Resa and I are not about fear mongering, but we are about expressing the truth and making people realize like what is the reality and what could happen.
I'll add that at the end of the day, we're all hired for a job, and that job often has a job description, roles and responsibilities. And I've been on teams where someone is not completing their own roles and responsibilities, and it really takes a hit to the team and the morale of the team, especially if you have a colleague, for example, that promises they're going to follow through, promises they're going to do their part, and they don't. It's really devastating to team morale, as I shared. And to really share one of the backbones of the book and the way we walk readers through our different chapters in our table of contents, we really believe everything starts with the self. And the more you're in a really good place with yourself, the better team player you are. And the better the function of the team, the better the work product. Now, these aren't all in isolation and they don't have to go linearly, but, we want the reader to really prioritize themselves so that then they're in a great place to prioritize the team and the work.
Yeah, and you're right. I do have a lot of stories, but let me just ask this question before we close out. A lot of people write books to give people advice, and then the question I have, because I don't know if it's a positive quality, but I'm like, are they following their own advice? Is this something that they really buy into, or are they just exercising and saying, I think I can sell some books that way? I know that you've had personal experiences where you've developed a skill set. Real quickly, just kind of tell how learning these micro skills, learning how to manage them, learning how to nurture them have helped you individually.
I want to comment on this idea of authors not sort of practicing what they preach. As Resa and I write the articles before and the book, and many times we might write something and then the other person says, I don't think we do this. Actually, I don't think this is actually authentic at all. And so I can think of many times where that's gone both ways. I think there was something on like we wrote an article on like snacks to eat. And I love seaweed. And Resa's like, I don't eat seaweed, so I don't think we should put that there. And I was like, but I love seaweed. So we really do call each other in and make sure that we are, that there is some truth to at least one of us living that advice that we're giving. In regards to a personal anecdote, I will say that the micro skill for setting up boundaries was a really, really defining moment for me. I'll make the story short because I know we're wrapping up, but there was a moment during COVID where I had a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old at home. And as you know, I think you mentioned that you have children. Kids are very ritualistic when it comes to bedtime. Like, it's insane. And when I was offered a panel to join a panel, and it was at 7 p.m. And so, or 6 p.m. But when I accepted, I was like, oh, this is like right during like dinner, bedtime. But I had that like fear of like, oh, what if I miss out? So I said yes. And of course, the night of, it's a disaster. My kids are like banging on the door. I'm trying to lock them out of my room, and I'm putting up the laptop, and I'm just hearing screaming on one side, and on the other side, I'm hearing, the panelists ask me questions. And the first question truly that they asked was, Dr. Landry, can you tell me about how you're able to balance work and life so well? And I was like, what? So you talk about being authentic. I was like, what am I doing here? So it was at that moment I said, never, literally never again. Resa knows I follow this so strictly. Never again am I doing these like evening things at home with my kids awake and alert. And so I started blocking out 6 to 9 p.m. And I realized that it had no impact on my career. I still progressed. And then I moved to weekends. Again, no impact. And I just started creating these like boundaries and realizing like when I want to work and when I need rest. And that was like a life-changing thing. And I think Resa subscribes to that in her own way. And we put that into the book.
And I'll say I really like this question, and I respect the skepticism because we know you have stories, Eric. Uh, but we definitely are not writing from a place of superiority or we've got this perfectly done and look at us. And that is exactly why we put in these pretty vulnerable, honest stories. Some where we succeeded, some where we epic failed. And, there are ones that I'm always working on. One for me is actually asking for and giving feedback because it's really hard. And I think it's the human condition to try to avoid anything that might be tough or conflicting. And so, anyway, these are works in progress. We're all works in progress as humans. And that's also why we importantly added that section of why this micro skill may be hard, because what might be really easy for me to learn and incorporate into my daily practice might be super hard for someone else and vice versa. So, we leave it open to sharing how we have not done this all right. In fact, we've done it, very wrong. But look, we've learned and it's made us kind of stronger, better, and seeing the workplace more realistically.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to infer anything about you two ladies. I know I know that you're sincere. But I felt that that's something that needs to come out. So
No, it's honestly the fair comment. Like we have seen it, so I think it was totally fair.
yeah, and so that leads me to my favorite part of the podcast, which is plugging the book. So tell people how they can get it, and also tell people how they can get in touch with you all to come and speak or ask questions or wherever the case may be.
So the book is available at all major bookstores. You can order at Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, Target, and then it could be at your local independent bookstore. So please check, and if not, request it. You can also order it on Audible, Kindle, and then as far as our contact information, Resa and I both have personal websites, AdairaLandryMD.com and ResaLewisMD.com, or just, MD. Okay. And then we are both on all the socials, LinkedIn, X, Instagram. I have a TikTok, but I don't use it because I don't like to dance. And I feel like you have to dance on TikTok.
You don't have to dance on TikTok. You don't have to dance.
I think you do. Well, anyway, so so I have it, but I don't use it. But so just you type in our names and you'll find us. And we are more than happy to answer questions, to come speak. We love to speak on these topics, so just feel free to reach out to us.
Yeah, podcasts, radio. We'd love to come to education institutions of learning, be they high school, college, community college, anyone, anywhere where learning skills for navigating work, no matter the industry, we think that our content can hit home.
All right, and the name of the book is called MicroSkills, Small Actions, Big Impact. And the authors are Dr. Adaira Landry and Dr. Resa Lewis. Ladies, thank y'all for taking the time out y'all day to come on the podcast. I'm really honored to have you. And anytime you want to come on and give glowing examples of political leaders, just feel free to come on.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks so much.
All right, guys, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So I want to thank my guests, Farah Harris, Dr. Adaira Landry, and Dr. Resa Lewis for coming on the podcast. Enjoyed my conversations with them, even though with Dr. Harris, we were dealing with some technical difficulties based on the storms that went through the Chicago area. That's where she's based out of. So I hope y'all appreciated my editing as best as I could. But, you got the gist of the interview. So, and I hope that's helpful, and I hope that you buy her book, The Color of Emotional Intelligence, as well as buying Dr. Landry and Dr. Lewis's book, MicroSkills. And speaking of Chicago, it looks like it's going to be a very exciting convention. So I need y'all to go to www.momenteric.com and make your donation. Uh, Leading into this podcast, we had a good week in raising money, and we want to keep the momentum going. So whatever you can do, whatever you can donate, please go ahead and do that. Because we're going to do some exciting things. I had mentioned about doing like a daily on Patreon that people can get for free. We're talking about doing a big closeout podcast, after the convention with, some heavy hitters as far as interviews go. And then the other thing is that there's a new site or app called Chatter, which was started by African American who it's very similar to Clubhouse. And so what I have thought of and set up is we're going to do live coverage from the convention floor. I'm going to be able to be on the floor and hear the speeches and all that. So if you want to hear the speeches and interact, right, and give your commentary about the speeches instead of hearing talking heads from the major networks, because there's going to be some speeches that you won't hear on the major networks. They won't cover them, but we'll do it, at least the speeches from 8:00 on. So, that'll give us about, a couple of hours, not unless somebody gets long-winded like former President Trump and speaks for an hour and a half, which I doubt anybody else would do that. That'll give you about a couple of hours to hear the speeches and probably hear some speeches from folks that you may not hear their whole speech on TV, not unless you watch it on C-SPAN. But unlike C-SPAN, you'll be able to chat in real time if you download the Chatter app. And as the people are either speaking or as you're after they do speak, and so I think I'll be able to interact with you as well, and I think that'll be an additional bonus as far as covering what looks like is going to be a very historic convention. All right, so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate y'all listening as always. Keep those donations coming, and until next time.